one of the best descriptions of it, although he didn't understand what was going on, is George Orwell. He had really no idea what was going on, but he was writing from the point of view of the Prüm militia, kind of semi-Trotskyite militia, and that's what he saw. So he didn't understand the anarchists at all. He didn't know anything about them. But he gave a very vivid portrayal of what it was like. So he'd never seen anything like that. You know, go through Barcelona, nobody's calling anyone sir. People are comrades. There's no hierarchy. People are participating. So I don't understand what it was. You know, a lot of things I don't like, but it's something you just have to appreciate. You know. Came back a couple months later, and he said it's totally different. You know, you're back to the bowing and scraping, the orders, Stalinist communist leadership had taken over, crushed the revolution, was in the process of crushing the revolution with the support of the West and the support of Franco. But that's, you know, even from his skewed perspective, just as a perceptive human being, he saw something really important happening here. And if you read the documents on the collectivization, by now they're available. Actually, when I was writing about it this long time ago, I had to use original documents, which I picked up in bookstores around 1940. But by now they're all available. It's a lot of scholarship. The original documents are out. You can really learn quite a lot about it. And yeah, it's an inspiring experience, I think, with lots of lessons.
Okay, Ushi.
You've said before that the class war is occurring, but that not everyone seems to be aware of that. Just a question that I would ask is, what do you think the significance and the relevance of class analysis is for libertarian social politics?
Yeah, remains of continuing relevance. There are class differences that are important. Part of the strength of the anarchist tradition is to recognize that that's only some of the forms of hierarchy and domination. There's a lot of others, but there's crucially significant. Struggling in Ireland all the time, and everywhere else. Recent strikes are an example. I mean, class war always goes on. There's one class that relentlessly fights class war, the business classes. They never relent for a minute. So they're always fighting a vicious class war. They want everybody else to pretend it doesn't exist. But you know, for them, it's a permanent war. Any attempt to, and the whole doctrinal system, schools, media, and so on, tries to prevent people from seeing it. They kind of we're all in it together, harmony, this and that. But what's the business world doing? And business and government are so closely connected, you can barely distinguish them. But business, government, educational hierarchies, they're always fighting a class war. And every time you look at an advertisement on television, it's class war. It's trying to turn you into a passive consumer, so you won't talk to other people and try to figure out something wrong with all these things. There's not a moment when you're not engaged in class war. You can decide, you can succumb until I'm going to notice it, but it's hitting you every minute of the day down to infants. I mean, when I watch television with my grandchildren, 3-year-old kids, just take a look at what's being presented to them on television. I mean, they're being deeply indoctrinated into passivity, conformism, consumerism, rejection of conflict, failing. This is just class war, constant class war, never stops. So sure, class analysis is important. It's not the only thing that's going on, but it's a major part.
Toby.
Having been part of the descent of politics and speaking at events like this since the American invasion of South Vietnam, how have you noticed a change in the reception of yourself and your ideas?
Well, when I started speaking about the invasion of South Vietnam, for one thing, you couldn't use the phrase. There was years. I mean, in an educated audience, you still can't use the phrase. Like I was talking at Harvard Graduate School, couldn't use the words. It'd be like talking Sumerian or something, because the words don't exist. I mean, have you ever seen it in a newspaper or scholarly work or anything? I mean, there's no such thing except in the real world. Yes, there was such a thing. So first of all, you couldn't talk about it. Furthermore, the audiences were 3 or 4 people in someone's living room, or occasionally be a church where there'd be 4 people there. The pastor who kindly gave us the church, the organizer, a drunk who walked in, some other guy wanted to murder me. The audience. When the anti-war movement began in the early 60s, even close to the like 1964, that late, if we wanted to have a meeting somewhere at, say, a college, we'd have to bring together, half a dozen topics, Iran, Venezuela, Brazil, Vietnam, and maybe you get 10 people to come out because they're interested in different things. In fact, the first pub, Boston, where I live, is the most liberal city in the country. They like to call themselves the Athens of America, Harvard, all this kind of stuff. But it's the center of American liberalism. I mean, the first public meeting against the war was the International Days of Solidarity Against the War. It was October 15th, 1965. And there were demonstrations all around the world. So we figured, okay, we'll try to have an outdoor demonstration in Boston. There had been one before on any scale. There's a place in Boston, it's Boston Common, which is like the free speech area, sort of Hyde Park. So there was a march down to Boston Common. A couple of speakers, I was supposed to be one of the speakers. Big mobs of counter-demonstrators, mostly coming from universities, there to break up the demonstration. Couldn't get a word out, nobody could be heard. In fact, the only reason we weren't slower was there were a couple hundred state cops around who didn't like what we were saying, but didn't want to see people murdered on the Boston Common. The next day, in the newspapers, take a look at the Boston Globe, the most liberal newspaper in the country. The front page, entire front page was devoted to this, and the big picture in front of a wounded soldier. There's a soldier fighting for freedom, and the rest of it was all about these commie rats trying to undermine our brave soldiers, that kind of stuff. The radio was full of it, just denunciations. If you go to Congress, the people who later pretended to be, after the war went sour, everybody suddenly became a long-time secret dove, really secret. But then the memoir, Kennedy memoir, so rewrote their memoirs and so on. I got a new story. But people like the people who later became celebrated as anti-war heroes, like Mansfield and others, were denouncing what they called the irresponsibility of the protesters. And in a way, they were right, because the protests were so mild, it was embarrassing. This was literally embarrassing to say the words. This was 4 years after Kennedy had launched a major war against South Vietnam. And before that war, there were about 70,000 people had been killed by the U.S. client state. 61, 62 was when the major war started, all against the South. But in February 1965, that's when they started bombing the North. And that's what you could protest against, the bombing of the North. And the rest, most of the anti-war movement from that point on was against the bombing of the North. Well, the bombing of the North was an atrocity, but it didn't come close to what was going on in South Vietnam. Not even close. But that's kind of gone from history. And part of the reason is that the anti-war movement either didn't understand, which is partly largely true, or just couldn't pick it up. Well, that was February 1965. By that time, there were about 200 or 250,000 American troops in South Vietnam rampaging, and the country was almost gone. I mean, it's totally devastated. And so it went. By 1967 and 68, there was a substantial popular movement, and tens of thousands of people, and sort of thing. But still, the focus was, mostly in Europe too, the focus was on bombing the North. And there's a reason for that. It's not a pretty reason. The reason is that the attack on South Vietnam was costless for the United States. I mean, just to killing and massacring completely defenseless people. Nobody cares. When he bombed North Vietnam, it was more dangerous. For one thing, you're hitting Russian ships at the Haiphong Harbor. You're bombing a Chinese railroad. The way the French built railroads, the Chinese railroad, people in the south happen to go through North Vietnam. So you start bombing a Chinese railroad, well, the Chinese might react, the Russians might react. If you bomb anywhere near Hanoi, you're bombing European embassies. And they get upset. Now, furthermore, there are reporters up there, so they'll go